Hello everyone, my name is Ian McNaught and I'm the Strategic Organisational Development Manager at the Scotland Excel Academy. So this short video replicates one of the Stay Connected online workshops and the topic is information-based decision making. So before we really get into some of that detail, I'd like to ask you to think about how you communicate information and whether you do that by text and or graphics, images, tables, etc. And I've got information in inverted commas for the moment because in a few slides we'll talk about what is data, what is information, and what is knowledge. So I'm using information at the moment just as that generic term. So when we're communicating information, when we are using information to help us make informed decisions, then obviously that's quite an important component of our thinking, of interpretation, and how we actually share our thinking with other people and how we involve other people in making group decisions. So if we're thinking just about information, it's often said there's so much information, there's too much information. So there's a comment here, there's a message being communicated to us in text that basically says there's too much information, we're drowning in it, and we don't have enough wisdom. And if we look to the future, people who can synthesize all that information, who can actually take a critical review of that, make a critique of the available information, and actually extract the right information at the right time, and then use that to make the appropriate decisions. So that's something we should think about in this information-based decision-making topic. If we then think about the image at the bottom, we all have got a preference of how we would like to see our data, of how we would like to be communicated with, and we might have kind of multiple biases to that. But whether it's text or whether it's images, if you just look at that bottom right-hand image and just have a think about it, what does that image communicate to you? What do you interpret from that? And if you were responsible for making a decision or being asked to make a decision or give your input to that, then what does that give you that helps you make that decision? I appreciate that's a bit of a kind of generic ask at the moment, but it's to get us to start to get us thinking, what do we see there? What jumps out? And if there's 10 people watching this video, do we all see the same thing? Do we see different things? And do we know that? If we continue to think about how we communicate information, back in March 2020, most of us were working in the office, an office environment, face-to-face. We could read people's body language, and that was our normal way of working. And now, in the global pandemic, most of us are not working in the office. We're working remotely, mostly from home, perhaps from other remote locations, but we're online. So if we think about the image to the left, do we communicate information differently online than we do face-to-face? Should we communicate it differently? If the software systems, if the software platforms are good, if the functionality is good, then the online experience can be very close to face-to-face. Now, not everyone will agree with that, and I accept that. It's not as easy to read body language online, but it can be done. There are some emotions we might miss. If we're trying to see, 9 people or 16 people on a small screen compared to just scanning around the room, it's certainly a different experience, and we might require different skills to be able to interpret what's happening from that. But that's currently our world, and so how do we adapt to that? And adapting to that, if you think about that in the image on the right, what does that communicate to you? What is our new norm going to be? Well, I think we probably all accept online provision is going to play a much larger part in how we interact with each other, how we communicate, how we share information, how we engage people, how we influence people, how we work together, how we collaborate. So if that's the case, how do we work towards making some decisions about what our new norm will be? And there's a lot in that image. Hopefully it speaks to different things to you. But as we interpret that, what does it really mean? What information does it convey? Is it something we think that could work? Or do we think, well, wait a minute, I just can't see how that could possibly work in that type of environment? What should a new work environment be? Data, information and knowledge is something that clearly we're going to be using continually. And if our environment is changing, if the communication medium is changing, and if we're working with each other in different ways, then how can we work in the most optimal way we can with the systems that we have to make informed decisions? If we just stay on communicating information for a little bit longer, and also the interpretation of what we see, then we're all taught we should communicate concisely and with impact. And the more senior we go, and the more interaction we have with senior people, the more important that becomes, because we probably don't get that long in front of senior decision makers. 5 minutes, 10 minutes perhaps to get a message across. And often we're asking for a decision or for support or people resource and or money. So it's about doing the job as well as we can. If we think about that, we need to think about the appropriate communication. What's important? What's the important information to convey? What's the important message? How urgent is it? And what's the impact of the decision? Now, the impact of the decision might be a commitment to invest money and time into something, into a new project. The impact of the decision should be thought about a bit more widely though, because that might completely change my way of working because of what's been implemented. My role might be expanded, it might be reduced, I might not have a role anymore. Perhaps my job is the automation is going to replace that. So as we think about our decision making, it's important to scope out as much as we can. And we'll come to that a bit later and we'll look at that in a bit of detail. So I'm just trying to ask you to think about this in the lead up to that. We then have to think how we're communicating. Is it oral communication? Is it a formal presentation? Is it a technical report in form of the actual discipline? Is it a change project? Is it a new way of working? Is it a procurement framework or whatever that discipline is? Are we communicating in meetings? And are they face-to-face or are they online? Maybe it's a hybrid of that, maybe there's a blend. So we have to think about the most appropriate communication approach we will have for these different communication channels. And certainly for electronic communication, it can be very, very easily misinterpreted. So we've got to think about our email communication. Maybe there's blogs, there's social media in the public domain, or maybe not in the public domain. Could be social media just on our intranet, just for an organisation. There could be webinars, there could be discussion forums, and if there are, they could be synchronous where we're all actually online at the same time discussing. They could be asynchronous where they're live for a period of time and we input when we can, and we read something, reflect on it and come back and actually contribute. All of these are valid, but we've got to think about how we communicate in the best way for each of these, and perhaps over multiple different channels. If we're thinking about that then, and we think about information, and I'm still thinking about information generically, then we should acknowledge that everyone will not interpret it in the same way. We might look at the same information, but we'll bring certain things to bear in that and we'll interpret that, and we may not all leave with a consistent understanding of that. And that's for many reasons, but that's quite important, or that's very important, because I might think I've communicated a message, but the 10 people in the room left with 3 different ideas or 3 different understandings, in which case we're obviously not working as one. And if I haven't realised that, or if we haven't talked about that, then we're going to be, obviously, that's quite counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. And we sometimes interpret things differently because we just don't have the time to focus on it. And we hear a lot about that in the moment, about how busy everyone is. I might not have the knowledge to understand the message you're communicating to me. That might be a gap in my knowledge, or I don't have that experience, never done that before. Or I simply may not have the ability. The interpretation of the message might have an impact on my personal working situation and or my personal working practice. And that might be a good thing and I might buy into it. It might not be a good thing for me personally, and I might not wish to accept that. So I will have a bias in my interpretation that I don't want to go there. I mentioned time constraints before, and that might just be with how busy we are and the priorities we have. We've only got so long to actually work on something, but equally we could be too busy and just never get to it. Or there could be a bias about interest. We're not really interested in what's been talked about, so we'll kind of get to it when we can or when we will. We're not really prioritising things. We make so many priorities, we just don't get a chance to do that. And last but certainly not least, we need to think about how we relate to that message. Do I understand how I relate to that? Where I might play a part in that, where my team might play a part in that, where my department might play a part in that. And if we're working cross-organisation, can I relate to where organisation can actually add value or acquire value from this information and from what's been communicated? We will cover relatedness in a future video, and we did that obviously in a previous Stay Connected workshop, but that's really quite a big deal. Because when people cannot relate to what's been said, they typically don't engage or not motivated, or they may actually react in quite a confrontational way and putting barriers up. So as we think about how we communicate information and use that information to inform our decision making, it's reasonably complex. There's quite a lot there, and the more people we engage with, the more different departments and functions and perhaps multiple organisations across a network, then it does get more complex. These fundamental things should help underpin how we approach that. So just as an example, and to get us thinking about some of that, if we look at the image on the right hand side, my question to you is, what do you see? So we're all looking at currently the same image, and what do we see? And specifically, do you see a parrot? Do you see a woman? Do you see something else? And what people normally see in this image, firstly, is a parrot. And if you look a bit closer, there's actually a woman there. And I believe this actually was a winner in a body art competition. So it's a kind of fun, light-hearted way of saying, look, we're looking at the same things, and most people can see the parrot. Some people can see the woman, and actually less can actually see both. And that kind of puts our kind of current thinking in context. If we are using information to inform our decision making, it's really quite important to just recognise we might not all interpret things the same way, or we won't all interpret the same way. The other thing to think about is the bit at the bottom, and we obviously can't do this in the video, but when we have the workshop, we do a wee live exercise, and you listen to the piece of audio that did the rounds on social media, and we asked, what do you hear? And most people hear either Yanni or Laurel. Very few people hear both. And it usually is quite a lively discussion about, why did you hear that? Because I can't hear that. The point is, we're hearing the same piece of audio, but we're interpreting the message differently, and we're actually hearing different things. And if this was something at work, and perhaps even a complex project, and the more complex it gets, obviously, the more difficult it becomes, and the clarity of our information exchange and our interpretation to inform our decision making clearly becomes crucial. So a couple of light-hearted things just to get us thinking, this isn't actually as easy as it first seems. Okay, I'd now like to stop thinking about information generically and explore that a little bit, because we usually use the terms data, information and knowledge interchangeably just in our normal work practice. And we normally communicate stuff across data, information, knowledge with the intention of creating value, sharing some expertise, influencing people, or delivering projects, the operating plan, the strategy, and to help us make decisions. But it's quite important to understand how consistent our understandings of these are, of data, information, knowledge, of our environment, of our social interactions. We often talk about informing our decisions through data. We talk about creating an evidence base, which is established through data, and that would help us make informed decisions. Scottish Government take that approach, all the time. That's talked about frequently. So the question is, how can we use information? And information at this point is generic. that will be effective to inform our decision making. And we do that as we work as a small group of individuals, as larger teams, as whole organisations, as cross organisations across networks. So we should think about, firstly, what data is. And data are the undigested facts and figures. So we collect data. If we do that ourselves, it's primary data. If we actually acquire data from other people and from other sources, it's secondary data. There isn't any question that data, information and knowledge are inextricably linked, but they are different. So data is the undigested facts and figures, and it's a record of signs and observations. That's all it is. So we haven't got any real meaning from data until we interpret it. In our kind of light-hearted approach to the previous image, or Yanni at Loro, that puts that in really, should put it in quite strong context. We then think of information. We take data and we present it in a particular way in relation to a particular context, a context of action. And as we do that, that's becoming information. But I would have taken that data and presented it in a particular way to my particular context. And if you did that, you might very well do that differently. And so as we are doing that, you could argue that doesn't provide an objective account of the real world, of my world, of your world, of all our worlds. And that's one way of looking at it. So it makes it a little bit contentious if we're not being consistent in our approach, in our context. Another way to think about it is information is the data you've processed or selected so that it meets your requirements. And that's important. It meets your requirements. My requirements might be different. The other 6 people in the group and the team, their requirements might be different. So we're all processing it slightly differently. But definitely, information is more valuable than data, conditional upon that particular way it's been processed, presented in the context. If we come to knowledge, we're taking it a step further, because there's a statement that says data and information by themselves lack meaning unless the reader, the recipient, has relevant knowledge to interpret that data and information. So people with different knowledge will interpret the same data and the same information differently. And the next bit might at first glance be a little bit philosophical, but there's a definition of knowledge which says it's justified true belief. So we believe we've got knowledge when we understand, or when we believe we understand. And if we're not consistent in our interpretation, which is often based on the knowledge we already have, we apply to data and information to interpret it and add a different meaning or extract meaning. And so our acquired knowledge and our existing knowledge combine to create new knowledge. So if you think of it like that, we're all applying what we know. If we don't know the same things, we know different things, then we will be creating different justified true beliefs. Thinking of that a bit further, if we think about belief as an individual's idea or a group's idea about what is truth, but that's always going to be problematic, because if we're a group, a working group or a project team, and we are debating that, we will come to either a compromise or an understanding, or perhaps some commonality and consistency in our thinking. And we've done that through our discussions, so that's socially constructed. But a different group of people might very well come to a different understanding. So that so-called truth is always contestable. We can transfer that, but if we transfer it to a different working group, then there's going to be a need to go through the same type of exercise to socially reconstruct it, for those people to apply what they know, the knowledge they have, to our message, and to go from there. And if we then finish off by thinking about knowledge is located in practice as well as thought, then we have to recreate that and reconstruct it in each new situation. I provided Just a summary here of data, information and knowledge. It's obviously not my work, I've quoted the source, but it might be helpful to think about the differences between them. We need all of them and one builds upon the other, but there's quite a lot of continual interpretation to ensure we get to a commonality of understanding and something we can use to inform our decision making. Maybe a couple of quick things to point out is data is explicit. It's the raw facts and figures. Information, it's got interpretation in there, and it's single loop learning, and it's adaptive. Knowledge takes it a step further. It's actually double loop learning. It's very much got a strong social context, and we need to think about tacit and explicit knowledge because each of us will bring different expertise to bear on the data and information that we're looking at. Yeah, if we think about the cognitive model, when we are processing information, we're trying to create knowledge. Some of that knowledge is tacit, it's in people's heads. Other components of that knowledge could be in actual practice or work practice within an organisation, and we're trying to capture all of that and document it. The sole objective there is to share knowledge. If we share knowledge across a wider audience, we should be more effective, we should be more expert, and we should be more productive. We should create more value and a higher quality service for what we do as an organisation. So there's some relationships that are worth considering. Those relationships are quite important because we're trying to establish a shared understanding. When we're working with the cognitive model, which I think we often are, we need to think about the attitudes and behaviours of people and how we create and share that knowledge. Again, I'm listing multiple models. I'm listing the two models of cognitive and community. And if you think about community, that social construction is really important, but it's based upon experience. And a lot of our experiences will be different. Some might be very different. What has been our work journey to get to where we are now? Public sector, private sector, how many different jobs have we done over which geographies, which countries, what type of experiences have we had? All of that forms who we are and forms our knowledge, whether it's tacit or explicit. Have we been exploiting things to create value? And have we been exploring things to create new things, new ways of working? So all of that forms that. So there's a lot of trust in here. There's a very, very strong collaborative approach. So we need to have an awareness of both of these models to help us get the best from that data, information, knowledge, and then work towards making the best decisions we can. Okay, so before we move on just a bit then, if we just briefly think about explicit and tacit. So explicit knowledge we can express verbally or in text. It's explicit, it's relatively easy to communicate, and we should have quite a high success factor of getting that message across, conditional upon what we've talked about already in terms of people's interpretation. Tacit knowledge is quite different. It's not easy to articulate this. It's not easy to communicate it because it resides in our heads. It's stuff that we know. It's who we are. It's the expertise that's basically ingrained in us through all our experiences. It can be quite complex or it can be difficult to explain. We just know how to do it and we do it intuitively. But if we are trying to upskill a team or share that tacit knowledge, it is quite difficult and time consuming to be able to do that. So we should be aware of the difference between explicit and tacit and the challenges that might come with those. A little bit different, but it's worth thinking about. I think it emphasises a point we've made up until now, is thinking about information. That information is combined with a manager's experience or a person's experience, combined with their experience and insight to create knowledge that can support effective action. So we're back to our experience and our tacit knowledge, which we've obviously been developing through our whole life or working career. Okay, if we were actually in a workshop, we would do this exercise, but in the video we won't, but I kept it in because I think it's worth thinking about, and it's certainly worth you having a go at this out with the video. This knowledge map grid, we don't often think like knowledge like this, or most of us don't often take the time actually to scope it out like this, but it can be quite a valuable experience. And what it says is on the x-axis, in the bottom left, it's undiffused knowledge. It's proprietary knowledge. It's not well known. So one or two people, a small number of people would actually know that. And that might be because it's intellectual property, or it might be because it's quite specialist, it's quite strong expertise. And then the other side is diffused knowledge, which is widespread. So almost all of us would know that, could know that. And then in the y-axis at the bottom, it's unstructured knowledge, it's tacit knowledge. It's in our heads, it's difficult to explain, it's difficult to share, and it's difficult to articulate. And then at the top of the y-axis, it's structured knowledge, it's explicit. It's much easier or easy to share. We're still going to interpret it based on our individual experience, our existing knowledge, but it's a lot easier to communicate, to articulate, and to share. If you were to think about your job and the stuff that you do and map that out, different tasks that I do, and map out what type of knowledge you're using as you do that, it'll build up a picture of who you are or what you do, in your work practice. If you do that as a team, it brings another dimension to it. It lets us see, look, where are we really working? And in other words, if we're working in an area which is widespread and explicit, then it's much easier to sustain that function, that team, that activity. If we're working where it's really quite proprietary, only a few people know it, it's tacit knowledge, it's in people's heads, if we lose that team member, either to bigger, better things, or they move jobs, or they're too busy to be involved in our project, then we're losing a lot of expertise. And then if you think about succession planning, it's very difficult to regain that expertise. So it's a basic model, but it can be really quite valuable. I'll leave it at that. In the next slide, there's some guidance just to help you fill that out if you wanted to do that. We've done that with some teams in some of the workshops, and it's really been really quite effective. We've done that in some of the programs. And when people stand back and look at that, they actually either realise quite how expert they are and how much value they're contributing, or it can be, we've got a problem here if that person leaves, or we expect they will succeed to a new role in the near future or in the midterm, and we need to be working on that succession planning, and we need some time to actually transfer that tacit knowledge, and it is difficult and time consuming, but therefore we do need the time to do it. So that kind of planning exercise can be quite useful. I still want to talk a wee bit more about data and information knowledge, and now we're adding wisdom into it. We've covered some of this before, so it's a different researcher's view of it, but I think it adds a little bit to it. If data is a product of observations which are of no value until processed into a usable form, becoming information. So we're starting with data, facts and figures, undigestible facts. We're observing that. That has little value until we can interpret it and add some more meaning, and that becomes information. And in turn, data leads to information, which in turn leads to knowledge. And this actual researcher then says leads to wisdom, which is a new dimension to it, but it's quite an important one that we'll come to in a second. Before we get there, if you think of that data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy, we're filtering things, we're reducing things, we're reading that and that, interpreting that, and we're transforming it into a new piece of knowledge. But the comment is there's lots of data, but there's really not that much wisdom. Very difficult to get to the point where we actually can create wisdom from that. We've got to go through quite a lot of steps. We might not get to wisdom because maybe we don't get to the point where we get some consistent interpretation. Maybe we're actually disagreeing on that because we're bringing what we know to bear in something, and we're all coming up with different ideas, and we can't yet get that. We can't make that decision to move forward. The bit at the bottom then talks about understanding is the ability to correct for errors. So we look at things and we apply what we know, and we actually understand some stuff, we correct those errors, and we go forward. But wisdom is the ability to see much longer term than that, the consequences of our actions and our decisions, and we can evaluate them to think about what the future would look like, or we could look at different scenarios. So I've highlighted a wee bit in a graphic that I used in a much earlier slide about starving for wisdom. Not easy to get wisdom, but if you think about our leaders who create the vision, then people at that level also need to be able to create wisdom, because they look at the whole organisation and they can actually scope and reflect on, well, if we do that, the consequences are this, and we can look to the future to think will we be in a better or a worse situation. And this is obviously massively complex. So we will look at a whole series of scenarios to try and actually scope that out and understand it the best we can at this time. Not easy at all, hence why wisdom is difficult, but ultimately we need some people getting there so that we can be on the right path. Okay, so changing the subject a bit and thinking about structured data and unstructured data. I'm not spending a lot of time in this, but it can be quite helpful. Structured data is highly organised. It's a prescribed format, it's a prescribed structure. We can usually search it, filter it, analyse it. It's often quantitative, it's often statistical, and we've got analytical tools to do that. So all of us should be able to do that. And it's certainly, we can extract and interpret our understanding from working in that way with structured data. It's usually the fundamental basis for our intelligence, and most of us work that way. Excel databases, we've got dashboards and KPIs and all of that, and so that can be quite effective. There is a growing thought where you deconstruct some of that data, and so you get unstructured data. Unstructured data is typically thought of being as much more qualitative, but we can get a lot more value from that. It's much more difficult to statistically analyse it unless we can translate it in some way. And sometimes it's text, it's images, it could be audio, it could be all of those things. It is more complex in that there's no predefined data format. It's not as easy to analyse, it's not as easy to interpret, but it often can give us additional meaning that we don't get from structured data. Structured data might tell us the answer is X, but the unstructured data might tell us why it's X. So it's fundamentally analogous to quantitative and qualitative, but it's harder to interpret, and it depends on your mindset. Some people value it, some people don't, but it's certainly something we should be considering as we think about our decision making. Just as a couple of examples to ask you to think about it, you could argue that the bottom left-hand image that I used earlier is unstructured data. When I look at that, what do I interpret from that, and what do you interpret from that? When I look at the image on the right, hopefully it illustrates a network of people. There's not any pattern there, is there? It's everywhere. It's very interactive and interdependent. So just to kind of ask us to think about that as we are working on interpreting data, information, knowledge, and working towards making our decisions. If we now think about decision making then, so you might think it's taken a long time to get here, but that data, information, knowledge, we often act intuitively and with understandings we already have. And if we're going to make truly informed decisions based on evidence and data, then we need to think a bit more deeply about that. You may be doing all that already, and that's great if you are. So decision making is challenging. It's one of the most crucial challenges for managers. It's been rated as being one of the most important attributes needed by senior managers, but it can be difficult and challenging in quite a fast-moving environment, and we often are in that fast-moving environment. We don't always have perfect conditions, and we often have uncertainty. We might have limited data, we might have limited information, there might be gaps in our knowledge, but we're trying to make the best decision we can, and we're expected to do that. So one of the things that we should be doing is scoping out all the alternatives that we can see, all from what is currently visible to us. And we acknowledge that we probably can't see everything. There are probably some things yet to happen that we can't anticipate, But from what is visible to us, from all the alternatives and variables we can identify, then we should consider all of that and select the most appropriate course of action within the time we've got available. We don't have infinite time to make decisions or to interpret or to analyse. And sometimes we have to make decisions very quickly. So that might be a mental process where you're intuitively working through that. You're thinking, well, I know that's there and that's there, and these people can do that, and if I make that decision, so we're thinking of that quite quickly, and that might be literally a minute to make that decision. In complex situations with complex data sets and a difficult decision to make, we would be scoping that out, and we probably would have multiple iterations, multiple scenarios, so we can actually satisfy ourselves we've thought about everything that we currently can think about. Before we make a decision, we should start with problem solving. And sometimes problem solving and decision making are used interchangeably, but they are different. So problem solving is about identifying the problem or the issue, maybe the opportunity. And then decision making is adopting a course of action to solve the problem or actually to pursue the opportunity. Some of what we'll talk about you might think is a bit simplistic because you might be doing this already quite intuitively. But when it's a difficult problem, it can be quite helpful. And if you're not currently doing it this way, then it'll be a good bit of guidance for that. So one of the researchers talks about 3 components of decision making. Identify all of the possible alternatives. It's a bit like what if. Okay, I know that and that, so if I do that, what will happen? What if I do it that way? Or what if I consider that? We're scoping that out. We're trying to understand what the possibilities are. And once we've done that, we're thinking about what are the consequences of each of these alternatives. And then we're evaluating the consequences to think, okay, so what's the best decision we can make? Or what's if it's not a good situation, and it sounds a bit negative, but what's the best of a bad bunch? We're trying to make the best decision we can. It is quite simplistic, but think about it. If you've to identify all the possible alternatives in a situation, how many variables have you got? How many alternatives are there? There could be quite a lot. And then think about, well, what does that mean? If I do that, what happens? What's the consequence? And once I've thought that through, evaluate them. What's the best one? What's the most appropriate one for us? What's the most appropriate one for us in the time we've got available with the people we've got and the money we've got? It's that kind of thinking. So there is I'll show you a checklist. I'll show you a checklist quite fairly briefly. And then I can leave you to reflect on that. So there's a decision-making model of these 10 steps, and it very much reflects what we just talked about. Think about the scope of the decision you're faced with. Consider the impact of the decisions and how you'll evaluate that. Think about who needs to be involved, and this bit's important because in your organisation, in your team, in our team, it could be very different. Who's got formal responsibility for the decision? Who will be accountable for it if it succeeds or it fails? Who's got the right experience and expertise to contribute? So everyone's opinion is valued. Some people are more expert than others. So we should think about that. That's not to say we discount somebody who's less experienced. They might have the best idea, but we should think about that experience and expertise. Who should be part of the working group that pursues this? Who's that diverse set of people that gives us the best chance of success? Once we have a course of action, who's responsible for implementing that? And obviously implementation is difficult and it's often very hard to come up with the new idea or making a decision. And if we need resources, people, money, who controls those resources? Might be the same person, it's probably very different people. Have we defined the issue, the problem, the opportunity? And have we collected, in this case, relevant information? It might be data, it might be information, it might be sharing knowledge. Hopefully it's all of that. Have we thought about uncertainty? What ifs happens? Different scenarios? Once you've gathered all of that, how are we going to make the decision? We might have quite a large data set at this point, and how will we make? What will we use to make the decision? Now, it might be intuitive, it might be obvious, it might be a gut reaction, but we should think that through. And there's a number of biases that we should at least consider. There's some psychological traps. We've already put in so much money into this, we've got to see it through. The sunk cost fallacy. It could be loss aversion or risk aversion. I might think I know how to do it, and I'm interpreting that, and yeah, that was the right way, and I've got a confirmation bias in that. You know, this is not exhaustive, but it's just asking us to think about that. Do we have any biases? Are we making sure we're thinking about as much as we possibly can? But once we've made the decision, how do we communicate that? And then enact on it. And if we have decision makers and stakeholders, how do we feed that back? So we're now back to communicating information. So we should think about our comms plan and the frequency and how we'll do that. And then we have to check it works. The decision we've made, we need to monitor it. It's a bit like plan, do, check, act. We're monitoring it and we're deciding, is this working as we thought it would? Is it better than what we did before? Is it solving the problem? And maybe there's a bit of lessons learned and there's a new iteration, and we go around that whole loop again. Underpinned by everything we've done with data, information and knowledge. Now, different model, and it's often called the rational model because there's a belief that fundamentally most of us think rationally, and it's kind of underpinned by that. Now, it's quite, or I find it quite laborious to talk through. So I've listed the 12 steps. I'm probably not going to use text. I'm going to use the next slide because I think it's a bit easier in a table. But before I do that, I'll just mention the part at the bottom about not all decision making is rational. We often like to think it is, and in the previous discussion we've had with the previous slide, if we've actually scoped it all out with all the variables and we've thought about all the scenarios and we've evaluated all of that and we've thought about all the consequences, then that's a rational way of approaching things. It's rational, it's logical, and it could actually very much facilitate us making the best decision that we can make. But sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes there could be somebody very influential who knows how to do it, believes they know how to do it, and that's where we're going. Sometimes it's intuitive, sometimes it's a gut reaction, and sometimes they're the right way to do it. So you might not need the checklist in the rational model, but sometimes you will if we just don't know where to go, or we've tried it once or twice and it's not working. We might have to step back and think, right, we need a different approach here. So don't dwell in the models if you don't need them. If you need them for a guide, certainly they're there to be used. And obviously, I'm only showing you 2 models, and this is not exhaustive by any means. Okay, if you think about then Kepner Tregoe's rational model, and if you start in the very left-hand column, what the model says is list all the objectives. List all the objectives you've decided you have to achieve A, B, C, D, E. And you're going to list some in musts and some in wants. We might not be able to do everything. Hopefully we can, but there might be a limitation of time and or resource. So musts and wants, so we're already starting to prioritise them. And then we give the column that says weight, we give it a value. So just let's say we said 1 to 10. We decide how important each of these musts are, how important the wants are. So like we said before, you then think about all the alternatives. So all I've shown you here is alternative option 1, 2 and 3. You could have 30, you could have 100. So then for each of those alternative options, we give it what we call a satisfaction score. So I've decided that option 1, I believe that's the way we should solve this problem. You've decided it's option 2, that's your approach to it, and our colleagues decided it's option 3. So we then, as a group, we talk about this and we debate, and we will need to compromise, we might have to influence, but we'll come to a consensus where there's enough agreement that we give a satisfaction score for each of these. Now that might mean some of the musts get a high score, it might mean some of the wants get a high score, but we actually work through that. So we have another column of quantified numbers where we'll give a satisfaction score. And then what we do is we multiply the value in the weight column by the value in the alternative option column, and we get a weighted score, that blue column. And we do the same for alternative option 2, and we do it for 3, and we might do it for the other 27. And then we then have a ranking and rating, because we've now got structured data, we've now got a quantified score. It says, actually, here's what we've got to achieve. in the weight, we think it's this important. If we take that approach, we score at X, we multiply the two, and it gives us a value, and we've done that for others, and it almost self-prioritises. Now, I certainly emphasise we don't always need this. Not every decision is complex enough to require it, but those that are, this is a useful way of doing it. For some, it might be a bit laborious. For some, it might be too structured. It just might be a bit too quantified, but it's very workable. And the psychology says most of us actually start with that rational approach. We don't always write it down like this. We sometimes do it very quickly, but we actually take that approach. We might not all take that approach. And again, this is a non-exhaustive list, but if you don't use the checklist, and if you don't use Kepner Tregoe's rational model, there's many other ways of doing this stuff. You might use force field analysis, you might use Boyd's OODA loop, you might use strengths and weaknesses. As simplistic as that's perceived, it can still be very useful. Cooperative learning placemat can be very useful for things like this, when we have those debates and then we actually have an agreement and a consensus. Pesto can be useful, scenario planning invaluable. When we're talking about interpretation, and each of us can interpret things in different ways, the Bono 6 thinking hats can be extremely useful. We can get more appreciation of why we're thinking different things. And if you really are not a structured data type person, maybe mind mapping helps you actually scope things out, and there's many, many others. All of these can be used very effectively as decision-making models to help us scope, understand, think about scenarios, consider the people, consider the variables, the consequences, the alternatives, therefore allow us to make the best decision we can make with what we can see at this time. Understanding that things might change next week, next month, and we might have taken a different approach had we known that. And that's an important part of decision making. That's why we have scenarios, that's why we have different iterations, that's why we have lessons learned. Now that we know that, or now that this has happened, we will take a different approach. Okay, we're just about to finish off then. So I'm showing you an image of part of the homepage of the Academy, and I've given the URL at the top. The Academy's got a lot of information in the public domain, so it's freely accessible. If you're on a program with us, you're in a secure domain, but there's a lot in the public domain. So feel free to use it. If you wanted to share some of your practice, we're happy to do that in the bottom right. Sharing practice in the orange icon, and that's your work. You'll be credited with that. We'll be sharing practice across our community. So that's an option if you're interested. Any literature that I've used, I've referenced for you, so you can see where it came from. You can actually follow up if you would like to do that, and leaving some contact details. So if there's anything you'd like to talk about, any ideas for future workshops, any questions to discuss this sort of stuff at all, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon.